Hey folks, it's Don. On this episode of The Naturalist, I'm back at Clifton Gorge State Nature Preserve to tell the story of Muggins, the black bear of Clifton Gorge. So let's go. Before we head back outside on site, I thought I'd give you a little bit of the backstory of Muggins and my own backstory with the Muggins story. So let me start there. I first heard about Muggins when I was visiting the gorge with a naturalist in residence there at the time, Tim Snyder, who was the site manager for Clifton Gorge Nature Preserve. He had told me a story about Muggins, and I, remained intrigued about it ever since. I've told little bits of this story through time in a couple of my episodes of this series that I filmed in Clifton Gorge, but I thought I'd devote an entire episode to Muggins, because there's a lot there to tell. So it starts with Muggins' origins. The story goes that George Washington Grindle and a friend of his, Mr. Stafford, were either on a hunting or fishing trip in Canada, somewhere just across the border from Michigan. And they were viewing bears at a dump. And for those of you who know anything about black bears, that's a common place to go see black bears, because they visit landfills, they visit dumps to scavenge. In fact, my own family used to go on fishing trips to Canada, and that's exactly one of the activities you would do, is go to a nearby local dump to view black bears. The time I went, we saw no black bears, but lots of raccoons. So, nonetheless, Grindle and his friend were viewing black bears at this dump, and what they observed was apparently a mother bear, a large female, and two cubs. And legend has it that they got a little too close, or whatever happened, and the mother charged, and she was shot, leaving two bears, live bears, at their disposal. Now, it's unclear, first, whether the story is exactly true, but second, what happened to one of the two bears. But the story is that one of those bears became Muggins and was brought back to Ohio. All right, so that's the origin of Muggins, is as a, quote, rescued black bear cub from Canada. All right, now, the original owner of Muggins was supposedly Stafford. Okay, that's the story, that Stafford owned the bear. But in this first picture I'll show, we see Muggins taken in the 1930s, where being on display at a gas station in Xenia. Not Xenia, but in Springfield. So the gas station was Sutton Motors, or the Studebaker Auto Agency, and she was kept on a leash, as you can see in the picture, and kind of treated like an attraction. And people would feed her candy and things like that. But pretty quickly, within a year, they found out that was unsustainable, as she grew, for example. And of course, this is where the unfortunate habit of feeding her snacks and treats really would have started. All right, now, in the picture that you see, the supposed owner is Harry and Bernard Sutton, okay, of the Sutton Motors, where Stafford was originally thought to be the owner. So that part is not clear, but this newspaper article indicates that Sutton, who owned the auto works, was the original owner. At the very least, Muggins was on display at Sutton Motors. All right, now, once it was found out that, this was unsustainable, or determined, Grindle became the owner, okay? Grindle lived on the edge of Clifton Gorge, near Clifton, Ohio. And he had a family, and they were, blue-collar folks doing, regular jobs. And Grindle took Muggins in. Maybe it was because of the wild natural location where the family lived, or some agreement that was made. It's not clear. But nonetheless, Grindal acquired official ownership of Muggins. Okay, now this story is set in Clifton Gorge. I started there, and I've had some episodes on that area. But for the better part of the 20th century, Clifton Gorge, which is now a nature preserve, was in private hands. And it was considered a tourist attraction, essentially, a roadside tourist attraction. And in this next picture, I will show you a picture taken from the river, the Little Miami River, down in the gorge, looking up at one of the access points to enter the gorge, where you could hike, walk around, and picnic and things like that. And in this picture, you'll see a stone bridge in the background, and that stone bridge carries Route 343 on top of it, heading into the town of Clifton. You can see ladders that would have allowed hikers or picnickers to access the gorge, because there's a very steep bank there. There are cliffs here, but the building of that bridge on over a little tributary to the Little Miami River made a little easier spot where people could descend down into the gorge. Okay, and that park that was developed was called Ferndale Park. And like I said, people could visit, hike, picnic. Another thing you could do, and you'll see in this next picture, is take boat rides on the river into the interior of the gorge. Okay, now the Little Miami River flows through a very narrow gorge at this point and flows pretty quickly through most of it, but there are long stretches that you'll see later in person where the water slows down, it gets very deep, and they could launch a boat and paddle you up into the gorge, just slowly meander up into the gorge in the narrowest part of the canyon, and just, spend a half an hour. Now, as I'll discuss later as well, people also, the gorge was kind of fairly exploited at that time. You could get down in it, you could walk around it, you could climb on the cliffs. They actually would collect plants from the cliff walls and sell them on these journeys, things like ferns and other interesting rare plants. So again, at this time, the gorge was fairly well exploited through these kinds of activities. That's why it becoming a nature preserve in 1973 was so important, all right? Now, back to Muggins and the Grindals. Well, at some point, and it's not clear when, Grindal established a roadside stand, okay? A little stand, which is a term I grew up with in Pennsylvania, meaning a little building. It often would have maybe a gas pump, and inside it'd be a candy store with maybe a couple of amenities. Usually these were very small structures selling drinks and snacks and candy and things like that. Grindal developed one of these on the rim of Clifton Gorge, and we'll see that location here soon. He built a cage for for Muggins, and she was on display at this stand. And in this picture, taken around 1950, you can see Muggins in this summer cage, which is a chain link fence cage. It looks to be about 10 feet high. I don't know if it had a top across it, probably did, with posts. And people could basically view her in this cage and surround her. And as you can see by her size, feed her snacks and drinks, which is one of the, memorable things that people talk about for those who can remember Muggins. All right, so here you can see visitors gathered around her, talking to her, whatever. I don't know if you could pet her. That's probably not advisable, but they would feed her snacks and things through that cage. So this was her summer cage, okay? Pretty rudimentary. The next picture is just another picture from that summer cage, showing you that she could do some tricks. I don't know how elaborate these tricks would be, but she could stand on her hind legs, for example, and this fellow in the picture is feeding her a bottle of soda pop. And apparently orange knee-high was one of her favorites, okay? And that, of course, contributed to her weight, which eventually reached 450 pounds. And so, which is well beyond the average size of a female black bear, which is, believe it or not, less than 200 pounds. Okay, so she was double to almost 3 times the size of a normal female black bear by the time she died. Okay, now these pictures come from the 50s and 60s and depict, you know, the memorable parts of Muggins at the gorge. She had a winter cage as well, which was apparently a very large hollow log. It must have been blocked off as well, that was near the house of Grindle, where she overwintered. I suppose that she sort of hibernated. I don't know how active she was over the winter. Ohio winters aren't exceptionally cold, but they get cold enough that a bear would want to hibernate. So she apparently slept in a winter cage in a hollow log in a different spot, but was brought back to her summer cage in the summer during tourist season. All right, now this was a pretty, you know, special thing to witness Muggins. Black bears were basically removed from the wild in Ohio by about 1850 due to habitat destruction, active removal. You know, bears and wolves and things, mountain lions were seen as predators, something to be feared and gotten rid of. And so black bears basically disappeared from the state by around 1850. Now they are back in the state, and I'm very pleased that in the area near Clifton Gorge, there was a black bear last year sighted. Probably for the first time since around 1850, a wild black bear roaming the woodlands. So at the time, however, in the mid-50s, 60s, and so forth, seeing a black bear in Ohio outside of a zoo would be unprecedented, all right? But again, in Ohio now, we are pleased to say there's a growing population of black bears. They're mostly in the eastern half of the state, probably less than 200 wild bears, but occasionally some young males will roam into western Ohio where we are, seeking a mate, and if they don't find any, they turn around and usually go back where they came from, okay? And we again witnessed that last year. Now what I'd like to do is head back out on site and show you some of the locations involved in the rest of the story about Muggins. So let's get back to Clifton Gorge. Next to the bear den is this tree cookie, a slice of a white oak tree that was cut down in 1985 in nearby John Bryan State Park. I guess it had to be cut down because it was declining and it was near the campground. And its rings were counted and it's been annotated, and it reveals a couple of really interesting things, especially to a tree person. So first of all, this is a white oak. It's about 3 feet in diameter. I've measured it before, and it was 294 years old when it was cut down. So that alone, I talk a lot about the size and age of trees on this series. So there's a 3-foot diameter white oak. We have trees much larger than this in Ohio that was 294 years old. I use this as an example that when you see a large tree, especially a large oak tree or white oak in particular, that's likely to be a very old tree, some cases 300 to 400 years old. We have white oaks in this state that are 600 years old. People seem to get surprised by this and underestimate the age of some of these trees. But here's a revelation. You can count the rings yourself, and they've been annotated with lots of, you know, major events that have occurred in this country. And in terms of this episode, it just does indicate there's a little annotation for when Muggins the bear died. All right, so Muggins died in 1968. This tree was cut down in 1985, and so Muggins is depicted there. But this tree goes back the whole way to 1691, the starting point in the center. And if you look at it carefully, and I've done this, I've taken measurements, there are periods of time on this tree where it barely grew for decades. It would have only increased in size by, say, an inch in 80 years in some places. Okay, so it had tremendously slow growing periods followed by some faster growing periods and so forth, which is typical as the landscape changes around it, as whether there's a drought year or a series of drought years and those kinds of things. Trees, you know, their growth rate changes through time, and you can see that here, although this tree pretty consistently grew slowly through most of its life. So this tree cookie is kind of a landmark here at Clifton Gorge, and for our purposes today depicts when Muggins died. Some early photos of Ferndale Park display one of the ways people entered the gorge, and that was through a ladder system that extended down and along this particular bridge, stone bridge that was built over the to carry the highway over a tributary to the Little Miami River. So it is hard to see from our view right here, but some historical pictures show a ladder system extending down from the banks here near this area, and then taking one more step down into the gorge to the river level below us. So I believe it was in this area right here where one of the entrances or exits to the gorge existed. If you wonder how you take a boat ride upriver in the Little Miami River at Clifton Gorge, there are a number of long pools, deep pools in the river in the most narrow part of the gorge here. So while I can hear falls, it would be hard to navigate upriver about 50, 60 yards below me. This whole section right here, which is now frozen over, is a long, deep pool that once you got into, you could easily row upstream. And it extends for another maybe 100 yards. It's quite deep as well. All right, so back when this was in private hands and people would rock climb in here and swim and things, this is one of the areas where they hung out a lot. And that all ended, of course, when this became a nature preserve, initially in 1973. But this would have been part of Ferndale Park, and a part where they presumably would have been conducting boat rides upriver into the gorge. Now what I'm seeing down there, just from a wildlife standpoint, are lots of footprints, tracks, and to me they look like coyote or fox tracks, and there's an outside chance there's some bobcat tracks down there. We do see bobcats occasionally in this area. I don't know of any specific legit reports from Clifton Gorge, but it's quite possible they are here. Other than that, they could be coyote or fox with those sorts of tracks. All right, goodbye Ferndale Park. I'm now standing near a kiosk and a little gathering space called the Bear's Den. And for all the time I lived here, I didn't connect the dots between the name of this little spot and Muggins the bear. But this little area is named in honor of Muggins. This lies right next to the Clifton Gorge State Nature Preserve Exploration Center, which is the headquarters for the preserve here and other facilities nearby. This is a newly opened facility. It's closed during the winter seasons, but it'll reopen in April. And so I'd encourage a visit there if possible. Okay, now this is the vicinity of where Grindal had his stand. I'm not sure exactly where it was located. I was hoping to get that information before I filmed, but nonetheless, it was in this general area, and Muggins' cage was also somewhere in this general area. I don't know if it was exactly where the Bear's Den is located or not, but close enough. Now, some other things outside of the stand that Grindal had, I read in some of my news pieces researching this topic that Grindal would sell ice cream from a little stand under a ledge here at Clifton Gorge. So if you take these stairs that allow you to descend into the gorge heading south, not north, but heading south. There is a ledge right here that could very well be the spot where Grindal sold ice cream. It's a nice flat area. I could see that being a cool little nook to attract visitors. But of course, one of the main attractions when you were here is to see Muggins, and often, again, feed Muggins snacks and drinks. So if we go back up here, let's tell the story of Muggins' demise. The story goes that sometime late on June 7th, 1968, Grindal heard a ruckus coming from Muggins' cage. And that was kind of odd for Muggins, who was a pretty docile bear. He got up, he was 82 years old at the time, and discovered that some boys had cut open the lock to Muggins' cage, and she escaped. She was nearby, but she had escaped. There was some idea that these boys gave her alcohol, so she was in a warped state of mind, again being a normally docile bear. But Grindal summoned help from a friend to try to get Muggins back in the cage. And what Muggins did was basically, in her hazy state of mind, attacked them, and they couldn't get her back in the cage. And ultimately, at one point, she charged one of them and went tumbling over the cliff into Clifton Gorge. All right, now it's not known exactly where that happened. It could be anywhere along this stretch. There are some steep cliffs down, just a little bit downriver. I'll profile from below. But she survived that initial fall, but was basically mortally wounded in the process. So more on that in our next segment. It's not clear exactly where Muggins went over the cliff. It was dark, it was a scramble. So that's the part we're not sure about. However, these sorts of cliffs, as you see behind me, are located within about 100 feet or so of Muggins' cage. So it's very possible that a site like this, Muggins could have tumbled over, hit the ground, where of course her body was bruised and battered and broken, but she survived that initial fall. Afterward, she wandered this gorge for several days. There was a search party. People looked for her on occasion and searched for her, and she was spotted a few days after the fall in the gorge, still alive. All right, so she basically roamed this area in her state of injury for 5 days until she was found downriver. Now, when she was alive and when she was a pet of Grindal, he would bring her down in the gorge and walk with her on a leash and let her play in the water and things like that. So one of the places she was found, which we'll look at next, was a place she was known to frequent or enjoy. So we'll head there next. Before I do that, however, I'd like to point out this beautiful chinkapin oak. This is a huge oak. It's probably 400 years old. And it's been caged because this fall I noticed that beavers had come up from the river and were starting to chew around the base of this tree, which they can eventually girdle a tree like this. They're unlikely to cut it down, that's for sure, but they can girdle it, debark it, and kill it. So I see that they now cage the tree in response to my observation. I'm now several hundred yards from where Muggins apparently fell over the cliff, downriver. I'm in the vicinity of Steamboat Rock. So that's Steamboat Rock. That's a large rock that people thought resembled a steamboat in the middle of the river, whose origin is from the cliffs up here. And at some point in the past, it broke free of that area, tumbled down into the gorge, into the river, landing in the middle. Actually, I'm not even sure which side of the cliff it came from. It could have been this side or that side over there. Nonetheless, that's Steamboat Rock. Legend has it that Grindle would bring Muggins downriver on his walks, and she liked to play in the water in this area. It slows down. There are rapids leading up to this, but it slows down in this vicinity. There's a large pool below it, for example. And the idea is that she'd play in the water and try to catch fish and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, this spot served as Muggins' final resting place. 5 days after the accident, her body was found right here, up against the basically Steamboat Rock, or the bank right below me. Again, it's not known if she wandered here and died here, or she died somewhere upriver and was washed down. It's not clear. Nonetheless, she was found here. She was huge. She was 450 pounds. So it was decided that they weren't going to try to drag her back out of this gorge, that they would burn her in a funeral pyre right here on the bank. I'm presuming right below where I stand. Staff at the Dayton Museum of Natural History got word of this funeral pyre right as it was about to happen, and they rushed out here. And 2 staff members were able to rescue the head of Muggins from the fire before her body was burned. And that skull then got cleaned up and put into the permanent collection at what was then the Dayton Museum of Natural History and is now the Boonshoft Museum of Discovery. So this was Muggins' final resting place. Again, presumably the funeral pyre was right below where I stand, and thus ended the living legacy of Muggins, but her existential legacy lives on. Now that we've learned about the demise of Muggins in Clifton Gorge and the rescue of her head by staff members at the Dayton Museum of Natural History, in this last picture I'll share with you today, we see Muggins' skull. And this skull is on display currently at the Boonshoft Museum of Discovery, as I've described, and along with a number of records about Muggins' history and escape and demise. Her skull was rescued, by the way. I found a few names by a D.G. Young and a Thomas Hewells, who submitted this skull to the museum on June 12th, 1968. And it was cleaned up, of course, and there's a display there. And when you look at it, and I've seen this in person, you can really look at her teeth. It's really interesting to see her teeth and how worn they are. As you look at this picture, look at her front teeth, her frontal jaw teeth, and her molars, and they're ground down quite a bit. So Muggins was apparently approaching 40 years old when she died, which, along with her massive size, which was record-setting essentially, she was one of the oldest bears on record at the time that she died. Wild bears only live maybe 15 years or so, 18 years in the wild. In the captivity, the oldest bear, I believe, is around 44 years old. So Muggins was approaching the oldest bear on record in captivity, and at the time that bear lived after Muggins. When they examined Muggins, the story first was that she broke her neck in the fall, but also they found a broken jaw on her skull when they, rescued it. So this is where Muggins exists in perpetuity. And if you're interested in this story and to honor Muggins' legacy, take a trip to Boonshoft Museum of Discovery and check out her skull yourself. I'd like to give special thanks to several people and organizations for information and pictures for this episode. First would go to Tim Snyder, that preserve manager from Clifton Gorge many years ago, who told me the story of Muggins for the first time, at least 25 years ago. I received updates from Michelle Comer at Clifton Gorge Nature Preserve as well. I'd also like to thank the Clark County Historical Society for providing some pictures and information that I've used in this story, as well as the Boonshoff Museum of Discovery and Jill Krieg and others, staff members there. And with that, I hope that you enjoyed this special episode of The Naturalist about Muggins, the black bear of Clifton Gorge. And until next time, this is Don signing out. Bye-bye.